Well, greetings, folks, and welcome to the Kale Zelden podcast. You may have seen me on the General Eclectic podcast that I do with Rod Dreher, and today I'm doing a solo gig here. And with me is a Dr. Larry Chapp. Dr. Chapp is a retired theology professor and a displaced or a misplaced Kansan. I'm sure he can clear that up for us.
A Nebraskan.
Nebraskan, who now lives in Pennsylvania, right? So working on a farm with his wife. So, Larry, how did you end up from Nebraska into the wilds of Pennsylvania on a farm?
Well, I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and went to seminary studying for the priesthood. I didn't follow through, actually. And, eventually, I went to graduate. I decided priesthood wasn't the thing. I went to graduate school at Fordham, got my doctorate at Fordham. So I was on the East Coast. Then my first job was at DeSales University in the Lehigh Valley, and meet my wife there. So that's how I got on the East Coast from Nebraska. But then, after about 20 years of teaching theology at DeSales, I don't know. There's no profound road to Damascus moment here. I just got tired of teaching. So that's the negative part of it. I was just growing weary of, blue books, grading, essays, papers, and the fact that modern higher education is increasingly insane. We could talk about that.
Yeah, I would. As you know, I'm a teacher. I teach at a high school, but I'm familiar with the landscape. So I get the weariness. Believe me. Yeah,
and so that's the negative part. The positive part was that my wife and I and the co-owner of our farm, Father John Gribowich, who's a priest in Brooklyn, a former student of ours, that's how we know him. He and my wife and I loved Dorothy Day and Peter Morin and the origins of the Catholic worker movement. We don't so much like the current Catholic worker movement, which has gone off the rails into leftist political woke nonsense. Yeah. But we love Dorothy Day and Peter. And just talking when God just increasingly placed it on all of our souls, independent of each other, start a farm, get back to the land, and then invite people to come and rejuvenate their spirit and the spirit of Peter Moore and Dorothy Day. We have a chapel on the grounds and so on. So that's, long story short, I got tired of teaching. I was drawn to the rural life and the vision of Peter Moore, and there you go.
So you've gone from in the slog of it in the classroom, teaching theology in whatever we're calling this post-modernity. So that has its own weariness. Of course, the decadence of higher education, I'm sure, was always nipping at your heels. But you're back on the land now. But you still you still have all this training. You still have all these framing devices that are, I'm sure, are hard to shut down. And so, I stumbled upon your piece. I think you put it out on March 10th, and it's called "The Numbing Down of the Church." I think that's what you titled the piece. Yeah. I must admit that I came across it because my good friend and sometimes podcast confrere Rod Dreher put it on a site, and he said, "Kale," in fact, he sent it to me. He said, "Kale, you got to read this. This is right up your alley." And so I'm at the barber shop with my son on my phone reading this thing and just delighting in it, I must say. But what inspired the piece, Larry? We'll get into the piece, everyone, so don't worry about that. But I'm just curious, what inspired the piece and how did it come to be?
Well, before I get to that, I just want to say that, the reason why I started the blog in the first place was after 7 years of farming, I decided, once a theologian, always a theologian. And I really needed to have an outlet to, speak my mind on theological matters, but without the constraints of scholarly academic apparatus. So I could just let it rip. I could just say things that I could never say before. And my style is acerbic and scorched earth and over the top. If you knew me, that's not out of the ordinary. That's the way I taught too. So anyway, what inspired this particular, and I'm really sort of hard to classify theologically. I'm in that ressourcement theology, De Lubac, Balthasar Ratzinger, those guys. Anyway,
The bad guys are the good guys. It's hard to tell these days, right?
Well,
I mean, who knows?
I know that to the tradies, they're all crypto modernists. To the liberals, they're all fascist right wingers.
Yeah. And so here we are, right? Stuck in the middle with
stuck in the middle, and not wanting to be stuck in the middle with neocons either. Right. And so I sometimes get lumped with them, and I'm not a neocon. And so anyway, what inspired this particular piece was anger. And it this was probably the angriest. I've now put out like 22 blog posts in the past year. It takes me a while to write these things. And I'm not like Rod. I can't crank stuff out every day.
Amazing. He's prolific.
Yeah. It takes me about a week to 9 days to crank these out. But anyway, this one was easy to write because it was prompted by anger. And I say so in the blog piece. Anger that takes the form of a righteous indignation. When I read that Cardinal Nighty-Night Tobin, Nighty-Night Baby Tobin, had been elevated by Pope Francis to the Congregation for Bishops, and this was on the heels of him already elevating the Cardinal of Cultural Appeasement, Cardinal Cupich.
Out of Chicago, everybody.
Out of Chicago. It's just becoming clearer and clearer to me that Pope Francis doesn't understand the American church, doesn't get the cultural obstacles that we are up against. And for him to appoint these kinds of cultural liberal appeasers, secularizers, to frame and form the future of the American church, that was a straw for me that broke the camel's back. It was a bridge too far. And I've been kind of a tepid supporter of Pope Francis in the sense that I wanted to at least defend him against the charge from the rad trads that he's a heretic. Because I think it's problematic for a Catholic if you start charging the Pope with heresy. So my instincts were to minimize all of that, all the while harboring a lot of sort of secret suspicions that at the very least he's not a very good Pope.
Similarly, I've come to this sort of in a similar vein. I myself, I'm a all of my memories of the papacy, in fact, I have an early memory. One of my first memories is I'm in my living room with my mother, and we're watching the television. And I don't know if it was a live broadcast in 1978 or if we were watching the news. But I remember watching the smoke come out of the Vatican and them announcing the name Karol Wojtyła as Pope. Now, I was a kid. I think I was 5 years old, thereabouts, when that happened. But I remember it distinctly because I remember that Carol was such a strange name to me. I don't know. But so all of my memories of the church are, from that moment forward. And for me personally, I found John Paul II to be incredibly charismatic and incredibly inspiring, and sort of heroic even. And so when he came to visit New Orleans when I was a kid, we all went and saw him in the Superdome, and it was a really an amazing affair. Anyway, so I was accustomed to thinking of the Pope as pretty awesome, to be blunt.
Oh yeah.
Inspiring both from a sort of world political stage standpoint, but also as I grew older and I read myself back into the church after I had sort of dramatically and histrionically left it as a teenager. Was, wow, this guy is a first-rate intellect, too. So I was sort of accustomed to being, I guess in retrospect, a kind of de facto ultramontanist. And then when Benedict followed, I was like, well, great. Benedict's great, too. I read Introduction to Christianity, and I've read a number of things. I just thought he was I thought that his reputation as being, the Rottweiler was undeserved and unfair.
Very much so.
Because he's just such a beautiful writer. So anyway, so when Francis rolls around, I just was not accustomed to sort of feeling this way, and then thinking this way, and harboring this kind of close to my chest for a long time. He is uncomfortable, I have to say, officially. And you mentioned in the piece here, I want to get into the opening image in just a minute, but you mentioned in the piece, since you brought this up, that there's been a crossing of the Rubicon of course, referencing Julius Caesar and him altering the course of history. What do you mean by that this is the moment that for you is the crossing of the Rubicon that would draw you out to be so clearly to voice your anger in such dramatic terms, Larry?
For two reasons. Number one, I'm old enough to remember the post-Vatican II turmoil. And we had a saying when I was a young man that many of the bishops that had been appointed to the episcopacy in the United States were a bunch of culturally appeasing liberals. And they were done so because of the apostolic delegate, Archbishop Jadot. So they were called Jadot bishops. Okay. And they had a certain type to them. And they were awful, most of them. They were terrible. All right? And they implemented the council. So I have this scarring within me, remembering then how John Paul, who made a series of really bad appointments too, but nevertheless, as a general rule, at least in my church, the American church, with some exceptions like Bernardine, made some very, very good episcopal appointments in this country and some sound ones. So I was just getting comfortable with that when along comes Francis. And my attitude with regard to this whole thing, the analogy with the Rubicon, is it's like deja vu all over again with regard to the Jadot bishops. To me, personnel is policy. It's one of my oldest sayings. I said this when I was at DeSales University. Forget your faculty handbook. Forget your policies. It's who you hire. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's what says what your vision really is.
Right, because that's the mission delivery point, right? I mean,
exactly.
That's the joint, yeah.
Especially in a church or in a university, the rubber meets the road with personnel because it is the human person that integrates faith with culture and puts those things together in idiosyncratic ways that can't be dictated by a policy from above. So when I was willing to give Pope Francis the benefit of the doubt, but then comes the Cupich appointment to the Congregation for Bishops, and I thought, well, not good. But then came Tobin, and that pushed me right. That's the crossing of the Rubicon in my point of view. That says to me the Cupich thing was not some sort of backroom payback for something Cupich did for him or something. This is a trend. This is now a trend where he is taking his preferred prelates, putting them in the Congregation for Bishops and saying, this is what I want the American episcopacy to look like. And that, for me, was the final straw. Okay, well, I do not trust Pope Francis to mold the American church any longer.
Right. So what is it specifically about, you've mentioned the word appeasement, sort of cultural modernist appeasement, I guess. What is it about sort of Cupich and Tobin that sort of sets it on fire for you? Like, what is it specific? We've made the crack about Nighty Night, so we can talk about the tweet. But what else is it about? It's not just the tweet for you, I'm assuming.
No. The tweet is indicative of a mendacious nature. I don't believe for a second that he was tweeting his sister.
No, of course not.
And most sane people don't. And by the way, his sisters, none of his sisters ever came out and said, yeah, by the way, that tweet, here it is. He tweeted me, and he does call me baby. Not one of them said. So anyway, but that's, okay, big deal. So he might be morally compromised in some way. Right. Who of us isn't in some sense? No, sure. To me, though, it is related to the issue. The main number one issue is marriage and the family, human sexuality, the whole LGBTQ steamrolling agenda. As we can see from the reactions to the CDF and Pope Francis coming out this past week and saying, no blessings of same-sex unions. Right. You see this visceral reaction coming from the American, that wing of the American church, and I just think you're going to see more of that under the leadership of a Tobin Cupich church. You are going to get more and more and more McElroy, Wilton Gregory. I mean, and the other thing that I say in the blog is, you know what? Yeah. These guys have, as I say in the blog, 1 degree of separation from Cardinal McCarrick, disgraced former Cardinal McCarrick. Once again, for Francis to appoint Wilton Gregory, who was a close associate of McCarrick's, to the diocese in Washington, where McCarrick did most of his nastiness, all right, is to me, can I say this? This is the Pope giving the American church the middle finger.
Well, right, which I feel similarly, and this is where my friends on the trad side of the dial, if you will, in my estimation, are perfectly correct. Like that they
Yes.
that they can so clearly see this, and and we can circle back to that. But I wanted to ask you, to what degree do you get upset about the sort of the theological project of appeasement, that's represented by a Cupich or a McElroy or a Tobin, and the sort of the personal rot, right? I mean, there seem to be two things that come together in these folks, which clearly and unequivocally are promoted by our Pope. So which one? Like, how do we weigh this? How do we handicap that?
Yeah, I mean, there's two kinds of corruption going on. All right, as I call it in my blog post, a famiculus rot. Famiculi are bacteria and dung beetles that live in excrement and so on.
Right.
And now the analogy limps a bit, right? Because dung beetles are actually good for the environment. They're nature's cleaner uppers. So the analogy does limp a little bit. I don't think these guys are cleaning anything up.
You mean no disrespect to the good work, the Lord's work that dung beetles actually do.
Exactly. I mean no insult to the dung beetle.
Yeah.
But it is a visceral image. To a human being, the thought of living off of excrement is probably not pleasant. So I used it. Right. So, but as we're actually working now on the follow up to blog post number 1. Where I continue these themes. I explain a little more deeply what numbing down the church means that I should have done in the first post, but I didn't. But anyway.
Well, you anticipate a question that I have. Good, I'm glad. So anyway, more to come, folks, more to come.
And I didn't quite make a proper distinction in the first post either between the just sort of regular moral rot that has always sort of afflicted the church in, power, greed, sex, lust, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And the deeper rot of cultural appeasement, the deeper rot of actually creating a church that is an anti-gospel. And I mean that sincerely, that this is a simulacrum or a counterfeit of Christian. I hate to sound like Vigano, but Vigano is not, he's crazy.
Yeah.
And he's out of his depth when he does theology, but he's not entirely wrong to see a certain project in the church as the creation of a counterfeit church. It's sort of looks and smells like Catholicism, but it's a Catholicism that has been hollowed out from within and replaced with a different ethos. Yeah, and that is a far different corruption.
Yeah, it's zombie Catholicism, right? I mean, it's that there's a that it has the outward appearance of the thing. And just the other day I was looking at some crazy to sort of continue the biology analogies here. But there are these microbes and these parasites that can attach themselves to like snails, and it makes them act crazy and weird colors and all kinds of So it looks like it is a snail, but it's no longer a snail. It's doing the bidding of the parasite. And
it's like the pod people in the old 50s movie. Yeah, right.
No, I think that's exactly right. And so something is activating this stuff, right? That it takes on. And I guess for the longest time, I must admit that this protracted problem that seems to be coming all the way from the top of our networked church has really caused me to more deeply reflect on my conception of the papacy, my conception of infallibility, and ultimately my conception of ecclesiology. And I don't know really where I am anymore. I was listening to a podcast, an evangelical podcast the other day, I think it's called the Holy Post Podcast. And at any rate, they interviewed a Southern Baptist, Russell Moore, and and he's fantastic. Anyway, they were talking about their own church and their own issues that they're really dealing with, which are real and substantial as well. And maybe we can talk about the cross institutional rot that seems to be all of a piece. But apparently he tells the story of a young man, a young Catholic man, who says he is done, right? And he says, look, it's not that I don't believe in what the Catholic Church teaches. Like, I am Catholic. I believe in all of the thing, right? But I no longer believe that my church believes what it says it believes. And that really hit me square across the chest.
That's the rot.
Yeah.
That's the rot.
And so I don't know what my ecclesiology even means anymore, and I have had to literally repent of my own kind of overly neat, clean ultramontanism because I think there's a problem there. Well, and I'm not a theologian, just for the record, you are, but I don't know where I stand now.
Well, I think you're in the same boat as a lot of people, and we could do a whole podcast just on this. Yeah. I really do believe that the surge that we are seeing among the rad trads right now, that surge would not have happened were it not for the fact that they've been radicalized by the exact confusion you're talking about, caused by Pope Francis. You're talking about a lot of Catholics who are already very conservative, but who truly believe that John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and even going further, Pius XII, and these guys, that these modern popes were so good. I mean, they were like great philosophers, the kings. The great thing about having a system where you're run by a sort of philosopher king is that it works great if you have a good philosopher and a good king. But when you get a lousy philosopher and a lousy king, it's horrible, and it throws you into a tailspin. Now, we've been so blessed by all these great popes in the 20th century. I, too, like you, was guilty of a certain papalolatry, a certain, I don't know if it's ultramontanism or whatever you want to call it. I placed way, way, way too much devotion and emphasis on the Bishop of Rome as the guarantor of everything. Now,
so why? So I want to jump in just real quick because I agree. Why do you think that was so attractive to you? I mean, I've been thinking about this myself, but if I think of myself in the late 80s and all throughout the 90s as I'm kind of coming into myself as an adult and as a sort of read my way back into the church, why was that so particularly alluring for people like you, for people like me?
Because at least for me, I am by absolute instinct a creature of transcendence. From the time I was a little kid, my mind was thinking in terms of ultimates and ultimacy. At first, it was, when I was very little, it was an interest in astronomy, and it was the space age. And
the heavens.
Big picture. Yeah. Well, that gradually, as I got older, morphed into philosophy, theology, faith, these sorts of... So the point is, that was then in contrast to the culture that I grew up in of the 60s and the 70s, both inside the church and out. So I was already instinctively saying, no.
Oh, wait a second. Yeah.
Ick. Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. And I was absolutely disgusted with the Catholicism that was being presented to me in catechism. I didn't go to Catholic school. In catechism in the 60s and 70s. And then, this is not the faith that I believe in. Do these people... So, but then along comes John Paul. Yeah. And I'm half Polish, so it kind of spoke to me as well.
Of course.
A little funny story, too. I was just freshly in the seminary, and we were all around the television set when the white smoke came out.
Okay.
And there's a bunch of us, and none of us had ever heard of Karol Wojtyła.
Yeah.
No, none of us. And so when the cardinal says, Cardinalum Wojtyła, a bunch of us said, "Oh, it's an African."
That's great.
Because the name sounded African, Wojtyła, but then somebody said, "No, it's the Polish Pope. It's the Polish," and I was immediately smitten, and immediately inspired as a young man. Look at the charisma of this man, the power of this man. Now we now know, in hindsight, he wasn't perfect. I do believe he was a saint, and he's still a hero of mine. Yeah. But he did continue to allow, despite his best efforts, this rot to continue in the church. So there's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So I have an image that I'm going to steal from.
But I want to come back to the ecclesiology too. But go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just real quick on this. I think of John Paul II and Benedict XVI sort of in this way, right? And there's an image that John Haidt uses in his book, The Righteous Mind, where he talks about, the elephant and the rider. And the rider sort of thinks he's doing one thing, but really the power rests in the elephant. And so any kind of move that you're going to make, you have to sort of align yourself with the larger force and kind of gently move it here and there. And so you can kid yourself into thinking that the rider is in control. And the rider's not really fully in control. And so I wonder if that sort of plays a part
That's absolutely correct. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that. Somebody on Facebook that I know posted that very analogy that you're discussing right now.
I love that. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the book, by the way. It's very good.
I'm going to have to get it because I'm reading this analogy, and he's basically saying the elephant represents the subconscious and cultural elements.
Exactly.
You're constantly, as an apologist, arguing with this or that proposition from the guy riding the elephant. Yeah. But in reality, you got to pay attention. You have to flip the script.
That's exactly right.
You have to flip the script. I did that as a teacher. The best evangelists in the church today are those that see the rot of our culture and the need to flip the script. And that's my problem with Cupich, Tobin, Gregory, McElroy, and these kinds of bishops that Francis is appointing. They're not going to flip the script. They're going to double down on the script. Yeah. And that's
where does that lead? Where does that lead? I mean, we have analogs here, right? Where does the script that they're trying to play lead to?
Anglicanism, Episcopalianism,
right? And I mean no disrespect to my Anglican Episcopalian friends, but let's be blunt and honest about it. Where are they now?
Yeah, I mentioned that in the blog. I said, exactly. Some say that the definition of insanity is committing the same mistake over and over, but expecting different results. It's not like we don't have a control in this experiment. For crying out loud, the German bishops are now wanting to emulate every liberal Protestant denomination in Europe, and those denominations are dead. Yeah. I mean, the highway.
What do you mean by dead, Larry?
Well, they're number one. The number of people that attend them continues to drop precipitously.
Right. So actually, there's no more people.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a literalness to the metaphor, right?
There are now more practicing Catholics and practicing Muslims in England than practicing Anglicans. And that is that's a sad indictment.
That's so
sad. All right. Last year, something like 100,000 Germans officially left the German church, which you have to do if you don't want to pay taxes to support that church.
To the church, which is why the Germans have so much outsized power, right?
Well, that's exactly what I'm mentioning in my current blog about how their power is way beyond what it should be, but it's because they're flush with cash. They're the second largest employer in Germany. They continue to have this bureaucratic clout in our bureaucratic church that is just, I mean, they're responsible for Pachamama and all that. Pachamama wasn't an idol. What it was a ham-handed German attempt at optics, public relations.
Interesting.
It's a sad attempt at relevance and enculturation. Look how great we are. Anyway, back to the decline of these liberal denominations.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
They're not only dying in terms of the people, the numbers.
Yeah.
They're moribund in the sense that they no longer espouse the gospel of Jesus Christ as it has been traditionally understood, even within the confines of those communions.
Right.
I mean, if you talk to most Anglican bishops today, I mean, what is it actually that they believe anymore in terms of historic Christianity?
None of it, as far as I can see.
None of it, because it doesn't square with LGBTQ ideology. It has to go. I mean, I was just having a conversation with a female Anglican priest the other day, about a month ago, in a Zoom meeting, and this became quite clear. I mean, she basically doesn't believe any of the historic doctrines of the church. So this is a private. It's both in terms of numbers declining, but also a gradual neutering of the Gospels. And the German bishops, and I'm using it because the American bishops of McElroy, Cupich, these guys, they want to follow this.
Right.
The German bishops are very, very clear and blunt when they say there is a gap between what the church teaches and what German culture will accept. And that gap is increasing every single day. So we see this synodal process as a way of bridging that gap. There's no bridge at all. It's appeasement. It's waving the white flag and saying, we simply want a church that reflects the Enlightenment values, postmodern values of secular German leftist woke culture. That's what we think we should become as a church. And that's the only way they're saying that's the only way we're going to survive as a church. Otherwise, we're going to lose numbers. Well, you're going to lose numbers even faster. And here, my next point would be this. Yeah. Along these same lines, Pope Francis, and to go back to the ecclesiology thing, the problem with Pope Francis is that he is re-empowering all the wrong people. And at the same time, in doing so, he's disempowering the base of Catholics, like the young man you just mentioned, who were so on fire for the church under John Paul and Benedict, who are now going, I feel like I was duped. I feel like the rug has been pulled up. He has just talked to the average, very devout, truly believing Catholic, whether it's a conservative or a rad-trad, and they're all deeply, deeply demoralized right now by this papacy. And for the reasons you say, does the church even believe anymore in the same things that I believe in? What does this do for our concept of the papacy? What it does is it makes us realize you can have bad popes. And we've had some real clunkers in the past. We've been blessed with good ones. Now we have what appears to be what I think is simply an incoherent papacy. And go ahead.
Yeah, so I tell you what it's done for me is it has rejuvenated my deep love and affection for Dante. I'm serious. I have taught Dante now for the last dozen or so years, and you sort of delight in seeing Boniface face down and whatever all the stuff. All the stuff, and so you realize, of course, I mean, on the one hand, you recognize, of course, that there's nothing new under the sun or below the sun or whatnot, but that I'm struck by our hesitancy to call it out when we see it. There has been, up until I would say the last year or so, I would say actually I dated at the McCarrick scandal. I think there had been a kind of an agreement amongst the faithful. And I don't mean to say that our trad friends are not the faithful, but besides the trads who have really been banging this gong for 5+ years, there had been a kind of an agreement, a nod that we were not going to go there, right? That we were going to sort of police, we were going to sort of tone police this stuff. We would explain it. Oh, well, he's really playing the long game, and he's doing this, that, and the other. And you need to, you just need to trust the process. I sort of, if anybody out there are NBA fans, like trust the process. And I think it became untenable for me to quote unquote trust the process in the aftermath of the McCarrick affair. And in that and this is what I saw. You call in the piece the de facto atheism of the church. And I, for a long time, have been saying amongst my friends that there's a sort of a practical nihilism of our church class. And can you just build that out a little bit? Because it really struck me when I read that in your March 10 piece. I was like, yes, that is exactly right. I mean, I don't think they really believe any of this stuff.
No, I don't either. And the fact is, I mean, every era, every culture is different from before. Not radically so necessarily, but analogically so. Each culture has its unique ethos. And the unique ethos of modernity is that it is at least agnostic. It is highly secularized. Mm-hmm. The entire edifice of the modern political world in the West is predicated on the idea that God doesn't matter.
Right.
And if God does, seriously, we have organized ourselves politically, and I'm not arguing for integralism here, but we could have that debate.
But later.
We have organized ourselves politically around the fundamental Enlightenment-based idea that societies do not need God as a central governing principle or Christianity in order to effectively govern. In fact, it would govern best without those things. Right. What that leads to then, in the day-to-day life of our culture, is a practical atheism. Because if God is not important to governing and how we organize ourselves around a set of goods, that means that God is practically non-existent. God isn't real. That God doesn't matter.
Right. He doesn't matter, and he isn't matter. Like in
exactly.
To play with that word.
And then you combine that then with the sort of strict atheism of people like Richard Dawkins, and the scientism and technocracy and consumerism of our culture, and our bourgeois obsession with attached garages and cul-de-sacs and McMansions. You see, the entire focus of the ethos of our culture is on this life and the well-being of people in this life, with a complete insouciance and indifference towards the next, which is really a practical denial of its reality. And my claim is that most church people in positions of leadership, whether they realize it or not, have drank deeply from the well of this ideology and are actually victims of a kind of reductionistic naturalism that really does deny the efficacy of the supernatural. This gets to my point about the numbing down of the church, which I explain more in this next blog post. What I mean by numbing down of the church is that we no longer get outraged by sin. We no longer we're pissed off at the corruption and McCarrick and all that. But
that's still externally directed, right? I mean, I can look at Uncle Ted and be like, oh, that son of a gun, right? Yeah. A lot harder for me to like, okay, Kale, like, what'd you do today? What'd you do yesterday? You know, that. Yeah. And I want to go back to Dante in a minute, but go ahead.
Yeah. And so we're no longer a church that really believes in the efficacy of the supernatural graces of transformation, repentance, conversion that Christ brings. Yeah, we have to be forgiving and compassionate and realizing that we all have sinful inclinations, but we're supposed to change. We're supposed to pursue holiness. We're supposed to be angry at sin. We are supposed to actually seek conversion. Go back and read the Pauline epistles. Go back and read the church fathers. Christianity was viewed as a reparative, transformative religion of change. Now we are a field hospital church. Well, that's true. We are a field hospital, but hospitals are meant to heal.
Right.
The last time I checked. And
well, that's the point, right? I mean, that is the mission of a hospital, is to heal. And if a hospital is not healing, then you really can't call it a hospital.
Exactly.
Right?
So my point go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the anger that you're talking about, you know, it tracks exactly. So Dante, of course, in the opening of Inferno, finds himself lost in the middle of the woods, and he doesn't know how the heck he got there. He's like, you know, which is, you know, phenomenologically speaking, absolutely accurate. You know, when you wake up to the reality of your own lostness, right? You like, how the heck did I get here, right? Of course, which strikes you as a ridiculous thing, but it's absolutely the way that it works, right? Yeah. So at any rate, he goes in and, you know, he meets Virgil, his idol, and Virgil's like, well, you're going to have to come with me. We have to see some things. And he goes, and so he goes in, and he's in, and the whole first third of his walk, his pilgrimage through hell, he keeps being moved by the stories that the sinners are telling him, and especially Paolo and Francesca, right? And so Francesca tells a sort of quintessential sad story about, you know, star-crossed lovers, right? That's sort of the basic idea. And Dante is so moved inappropriately by her sob story that he literally passes out. He's so overcome with emotion, right? And what he learns, and of course, he's making fun of himself because he, of course, was a former love poet, right? And so he's making fun of himself because he's saying, when I'm in sin, I feel incorrectly. And like, what is more like countercultural in 2021 than the notion that you can feel incorrectly? Right. So at any rate, as he goes down, he eventually learns to see that, wait a second, none of these people are owning their own, what we would say in 2020, complicity in their own demise. They're all pointing fingers. And so what he learns rather quickly, or, you know, midway through, is that the proper response to sin is not, oh, that's so. The proper response is anger, so much so that at the very end, when he's on the ices of Cocytus, right, he inadvertently kicks the head of Boca, you know, because that's the proper response to sin. And we forget that in our rush to mercy and compassion, which are real things, right? I mean, I'm not a complete insensate jerk, but you know, but the anger is a real thing, and it's a necessary thing, and we seem to be really uncomfortable with that, and I wonder why.
Yeah, it's I think got a lot to do with simply an uncomfortableness with the very notion of sin. It goes along with this sort of de facto atheism and a kind of naturalizing of virtues, which our virtues and vices are no longer seen in a spiritual light, but are simply viewed as remnants of our simian evolutionary inheritance, which are more properly managed through science. The social sciences, the sciences of the mind, economics, politics. This is why people today on the left are so on the right with politics, because we view that as that which will now tame our simian inheritance.
But my question about that is always the same. Like I've read deeply in sciences and evolutionary biology and in psychology, and they indeed provide us with helpful frames with which to see things, to see the truth, right? To apprehend the real. But what they never seem to get at is, well, where do they get the basis for their moral standing, right? Are you aware of your frame in which you say simply, that is good, that is bad? And they don't, right? These are inherited instincts, I guess they might say, but they don't quite come to terms with their moral sensibilities.
No, they really don't. It's all very superficial and emotive. I mean, among the better of them, you get moral theorists like John and political theorists like John Rawls. They put a nice happy face on it and put together a fairly cogent account of, well, here's how we come to a moral accounting of things. But my problem with it all is that it's all quite superficial. It's bad phenomenology of how we make moral decisions. Nobody thinks that way. When you come across a Nazi death camp, your reaction isn't, well, this violates enlightened self-interest, which is why it's wrong. Right. No, you're outraged by it. You're appalled, and you feel like something has to be done to redress this wrong. That's our sense of justice. And no, none of these liberal moral theories really give a proper accounting for our sense of justice, so that even when things are made right on a utilitarian level, we might still be pissed off. We might still be outraged at something. Wait a minute. It still leaves this in play. And so you're saying, okay, there's a remainder that doesn't account for. Okay. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the good news, of course, is that we have the good news, right? You and I are both Catholics, and we believe that it is, in many respects, the compelling case. And so we have, and so the good news as well, theoretically, is that we have amongst us the descendants, right? By anointing, the descendants of Peter and Paul and James and John, etc. We have amongst us, in an unbroken chain, men who have been consecrated by a man who has been consecrated by a man who's been consecrated by a man, all the way back to St. Peter, right?
Right.
And so,
and I believe that. I believe that.
Yeah, me too. Like, that's good, right? I mean, that is a miracle. Okay, but we have men who, apostles are supposed to be those who walk close with Jesus, right?
Yes.
And they don't seem to give a hoot about walking with Jesus. You mention in the piece a kind of the one remaining sacramental of the modern church as the envelope. Why is this the sacramental substitute?
Because it involves money. For example, I know a good priest. He's a former seminary classmate of mine. He's one of the good guys.
Yep.
And he was talking about, we got to discussing, as we do sometimes, very honestly, about holy days of obligation.
Yes.
Where Ash Wednesday is not a holy day of obligation, but 800 Marian feasts are. So
that's
we were
right.
like,
that's right.
What is the reason? And he said to me, Larry, look, we discuss all this all the time as priests, and I've mentioned it to my bishop, and the bottom line is this: you get rid of holy days of obligation, you get rid of envelopes. People go to Mass on those holy days, and often those holidays involve that extra envelope.
Oh, I remember. Yeah, I remember. I know the extra envelope. Yeah,
The extra envelope. This is the feast of Saint Figida, and you got the Saint Figida extra envelope here. And he says, "I'm telling you, Larry, it really does kind of come down to that." And so I just use that as a humorous story. And obviously,
but I think there's an
the
insight
church
there,
needs
Larry.
money. Yeah, no, there is. That as long as we grease the wheels of this system by continuing to stuff those envelopes, the bishops are perfectly content to continue on with business as usual to save the appearances.
Because they hope to ride this out to retirement, right?
Yeah, they do.
Right, as you say.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what could be more bourgeois than that?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, as someone, of course, I would love to retire. I don't see it in the cards for me personally. But, at any rate,
No, I believe that I know a lot of bishops personally. I'm sure you do too. A lot of them are really good men. My point in the post isn't to say, oh, these are evil men. My point is that individually good men become men without chests, as C.S. Lewis would say.
I love that, yeah.
When they get caught up in this system of groupthink, never criticize a brother bishop. George Weigel just had an interesting essay where he said, go back to the early church and you see bishops criticizing other bishops all the time in very direct and blunt ways. The problem with the modern American episcopacy is they don't criticize ever any of their fellow bishops publicly, not even McCarrick, for crying out loud.
I mean, can you imagine Paul, right?
Oh, yeah.
Paul, he calls out, Peter.
Yes.
Says, hey, yo, Peter,
So yeah, there's this culture of we just want to keep the ship afloat, and we don't want it to sink under our watch. And so as long as those envelopes keep coming in, and the wheels of our bureaucracy are greased with enough money to keep our schools open and the air conditioning working in the churches, then all is okay.
Okay.
When in fact it's rotting from within.
Right. Okay. So we're in this sort of interesting moment. We are just a couple of days after the 1-year anniversary of the shutdown, right?
Right.
So middle of March here. I think it's St. Patrick's Day, actually.
It is.
Which is another fun thing we could talk about later on, but fine, whatever. I predict that the church, the American church, will be unable to regather the fold and say, okay, folks, we've had a year off from your obligation, using that word, right, that you quipped on. I don't see how they can flip that switch back in any practical way.
I know for a fact that in talking with priests and bishops that this is a huge concern that they have. We're not the only ones who are wondering about this. They're wondering too. Now that we've essentially said you don't need the Eucharist,
right,
and you don't need the sacraments,
right. What else?
Go home and do your private devotions and your private prayers. Watch Mass on TV or whatever, if that.
Yeah, think good thoughts. I mean, how many times have we used to make fun of that? Just visualize world peace. Think good thoughts. No.
Because you're already talking about, as I said, a church for whom, and it's not just a problem. I'm going to write a future blog post, by the way, that might lose me a lot of subscribers, but it's going to be called "The Laity Get the Clergy They Deserve."
Man, you and I are very on track here.
The lukewarmness of our clergy with the lukewarmness of the laity.
Well,
so the fact that they would not go back, exactly.
Priests, because imagine if they get up and they preach the gospel full-throated, they're going to get trashed.
Held both from their bishop and from the lay people. The bishop will trash them because the lay people are writing nasty letters to the bishop saying, hey, Father so-and-so got rid of this and he added that and he got rid of this music and replaced it with that music and blah. You can't do a damn thing because of the lukewarmness of these lay people. And I predict that many of the lukewarm lay people will not return to church after the lockdowns are over. They feel liberated by all of this.
Yeah. So I remember as a kid, I was I think 16, and I'd gone to a Catholic school, and the gospel that we were preached to was a social justice gospel. And I remember,
Me too.
and it was completely denuded of any kind of supernatural. There was no such thing as evil. There was no such thing as the supernatural. And I remember at 16, and I was an above average intelligence kid, but I wasn't particularly well read. I certainly wasn't, right in the middle of the pack kind of a kid. And I just remember putting two and two together. It's like, well, if what you're saying is correct, then, I'll just work the soup kitchen on Saturday afternoon, and then I'll just go ahead and sleep in on Sundays because this is absurd. The music's bad. The buildings are terrible. Nobody in here seems to give a crap about anything. And I don't want to have that awkward moment where the little basket comes around and I have to sort of, pat my pocket and say, oh, no money, and then pass it on. I mean, this is just a charade. You say, of course, it's kabuki theater.
Yeah. It's got the mask and the makeup, and and it's got all the outward appearances of a lived Catholicism, but it's been hollowed out very much so from within, and laity bear a great deal of responsibility here for this, in other words, they've got a greater devotion to their bourgeois lifestyle, their bourgeois sense of well-being,
right,
than they do to any historic sense of the faith. And it really, I have a priest friend, and he frequently tweets me after he does, say, a funeral or a wake or a wedding.
Oh yeah.
And what he not tweet, well, he'll message me. I know I'm not on Twitter. He'll message me and say, Larry, I am more convinced than ever that nobody believes anything anymore. Yeah. And what he means, obviously some do, but that there is this undercurrent of disbelief that runs through the church. I want to go one last thing before we got to sign off here.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that there's this intrinsic connection between, being a bishop and a priest and a certain expectation of holiness.
Yep.
Right? And so
yes.
Rod Dreher has the Benedict option out there. I'm thinking of I'm gonna do a spoiler here and say that I think that in this 4 or 5 part series of blogs I'm working on right now on the numbing of the church, I think the subtitle of the last one is going to be the semi-donatist option.
Oh,
and for those of your those of your semi-furry, those of your listeners or viewers the Donatists were a group of, early Christian Catholics who were very, very upset that bishops and priests who, in a sense, crumbled under the Roman persecutions and sort of denied the faith, had turned over holy books and stuff like that, were now rehabilitated and allowed back as bishops and priests. And the Donatists were saying their sacraments are invalid. Yeah. The sacraments are invalid because they were apostates and came back, and therefore, since they're not holy men, the sacraments are. Now, the church rightly condemned that view.
I love this too, right? Because on the theological merits, I absolutely agree with the church. Yeah. But on the phenomenological level, I'm like, those bastards, right? Those sons of guns.
See,
right? Yeah.
What I'm saying is, ex opere operato was the church's response. That
of course, right.
As long as the priest is validly ordained, or the bishop, and is doing what the church does in the sacraments, we cannot tie the validity of the sacrament to the personal holiness of the minister. And thank God. I mean, otherwise all of McCarrick's Eucharist would have been invalid.
Sure.
So,
right, but you can see why it sets up a perverse incentive.
It does. What it does then is ex opere operato becomes this battering ram, this gigantic excuse for simply saying, well, like the talking heads, same as it ever was. Who cares? Ex opere operato. It's all valid anyway.
Right.
But the Donatists were onto something.
Yeah.
Which is why
I agree.
I call it the semi-Donatist option.
Yeah.
Semi because you can't go along with their invalidating of the sacraments. Yeah. But Donatist in the sense of saying we expect our ministers to be holy, or at least attempting to be holy.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't seem to be the case that barely even lip service is given to the expectation. I mean, I've got stories of you know this better than me. You were actually in the seminary,
and for a long time.
And I know that this can change from seminary to seminary and from era to era within the last within our lifetimes. But guys were encouraged to date. Guys were encouraged to do all these things. It's like, well, what do you think that's going to do?
Guys were encouraged to date each other.
Right.
So, I was in seminary for 7 years. full
Wow.
disclosure, I'm actually a laicized deacon. I was a transitional deacon.
Wow, that's late, Larry. I didn't
Yeah.
wow.
Oh, yeah. And 2 months away from ordination to the priesthood when I said, no. I knew I wasn't, I just knew I wasn't vocationally called. I knew I was attracted to theology and the academic life, and that had sustained me through seminary.
Yeah.
The whole academic life. But once I was a deacon and actually in ministry, I began to realize I don't want to. Wait a minute. No, I remember when the moment hit me. I was in the parish basement at the orders of the rector of the cathedral in Arlington, Virginia, where I was sent, and he wanted me to measure the width of the toilet seats. They had put new toilet seats in the parish hall, and many of the ladies were complaining that they were too wide and they were falling through. God. So I'm on my hands and knees measuring toilet seats, and I had this is not good. This is you see, the ladies' man does not like this was just horrifying to me. And so I thought, I'm not holy enough and humble enough to do this. I want to read books and be academic. So I left and I got laicized and all that kind of stuff. But my point is this: I know the seminary well inside, and what was encouraged was appalling, absolutely appalling. And no real expectation of holiness. And this goes back now to the Cupich, Tobin
good
thing that I want to circle the wagon and come back to as we're sort of winding up here, which is this. What I experienced in the seminary was persecution because I was a Catholic.
Yeah.
What many of my fellow seminarians who thought like me felt was the same thing. Yeah. To be a Christian was to be unchristian. Yeah. To be a Catholic was to be a scrupulous little. That's right. Yeah. So, like I remember I once complained to a superior. Let's put, my dog is barking. I complained to a superior that I had been propositioned sexually, homosexually in the showers and told that the problem was mine for being judgmental. Rigid and judgmental. Judgmental, and all of those things. My fear. My wife was actually on the team that investigated seminaries back in and realizing
90s?
In the late after 2002.
Okay.
When the sex abuse.
Yes.
My wife also has a PhD in theology and runs the online theology program for St. Joseph's College in Maine. I'll give it a plug there. Yeah, very good Orthodox program. Yeah. Go to it if you want an online degree, undergraduate, graduate. Anyway, she was on that seminary committee, and she said, "Okay, changes are being made. Things are improving." And I know the rector at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, Monsignor Andy Baker, priest of the Allentown Diocese where I used to live, great rector. Certain things are changing. My fear, though, is if the episcopacy changes back to what it was in the 60s and 70s, we're going to be right back to a situation where young men going into the seminary are actually discouraged to live the church's life. Moral, spiritual, theological, that to be a Catholic is to be un-Catholic and to be persecuted for that.
That's the upside down clown world we find ourselves in, right?
Absolutely.
This is decadence, right? This is you talk about the crossing of the Rubicon. My concern is exactly that there's going to be a sort of a complete flip back, and we're going to be headed back to what you say in the piece, this highway to nowhere. And so a good friend of mine, he's a trad guy. He runs 1 Peter 5, and I know there's going to
Steve Skojek.
Yeah, Steve.
I don't know him personally, but he's a traddie, but he's a smart.
He's a good guy. He's a really great guy, and I've gotten to know him well. And he's very smart. He's very circumspect. He is not a LARPer. And his sort of latest take now is like, Kale, in keeping with your sort of talk about the rot here, it's just all got to blow up. Yeah, from parish life all the way and up, it's just all got to blow up.
I knew I liked Steve for a reason. If you talk to him again, tell him that I don't even know he knows me from Adam, although he's a Facebook friend. I don't always agree with him. But but I like his style, and he's got sound instincts, and what you just said is one of them. This priest friend I was telling you about who said nobody believes anything anymore all the time. He keeps sending texts saying, "Larry, it just needs to be burned down. Yeah, we need to burn the thing down."
No, I think that's right, and it's painful to say that out loud, but it seems to me that the entire apparatus, like the entire thing. I mean, think about how dead the parish system is now,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
it really has lived off a kind of borrowed existence for years, decades actually, you know, and you know it's essentially meaningless, right?
Oh, very much so.
And and so
It's not where we find Christian community.
absolutely not. No, it's absolutely not. In fact, I struggle with this. I know you and I talked about this before, but you know, if I have to go to a local parish, I live at a monastery, so I'm very fortunate. But when I have to go to, if I miss mass for whatever reason, it's soul crushing. I mean, truly soul crushing. And I'm not, I come to this. I've never come to this from a sort of like a liturgy wars guy.
Me
But
either.
but I've become more of like a liturgy wars guy because I just want some kind of reverence and holiness. I want some sense that somebody else in the room believes this stuff, that I
Yeah.
pray for every day.
It could be a chicken and the egg thing. I just don't know. I mean, I'm not one of these people that says the Novus Ordo is just this horrible. I've seen it done beautifully and reverently, but that's very, very rarely.
Yeah.
The fact is, most parishes don't do it beautifully and reverently, and it just simply becomes a banal expression of the banality of the faith life that is it. There is no Christian community. There is no shared faith life, not by any stretch of the imagination, and the liturgy reflects that. So I'm not certain, by the way, whether or not if we change the Novus Ordo over to a traditional Latin Mass, if the disbelief remained, whether the traditional Latin Mass would be anything radically different.
Well, I don't know, of course, because I'm not a prophet, but I'll say this, cue the crappy song that I had to grow up singing, but
Right.
we have indeed sung this church into being, and let me tell you, it's
Yes.
an abomination.
That's why I said it could be a chicken and the egg thing where I'm not quite sure how to explain it. I'm not certain that a TLM Mass would necessarily change disbelief. But on the other hand, you are exactly right. Objectively, the traditional Latin Mass, I think, is a superior rite to the Novus Ordo liturgy.
Yeah.
We need to reform the reform. Now, having said that, I don't think the TLM is coming back ever again as the central ordinary form of the liturgy of the Catholic Church.
And do you say that because you just know too much about the institutional church?
Well, yeah, in the sense that I've been around the world. I know of Catholic. There's no way that African Catholics want to pray the traditional Latin Mass, or Asian Catholics, or Filipino Catholics. They don't want. Will there be pockets of people that like that? Sure. So I'm glad that it's allowed. I'm glad that it isn't abrogated anymore. It's a beautiful liturgy.
Yeah.
But I think the trads need to get out of their own way a bit here and realize that the future of the church, if it is going to be elevated liturgically, is in some version of a vernacular Mass with prayers said out loud and increased dialogical responses from the laity. I attend an Anglican ordinariate liturgy, having been completely disgusted with Novus Ordo liturgies and parishes, and I admit I parish shopped, and I have no problem with parish shopping. If the church isn't going to provide me with the faith life that I need in a parish, then stop demanding that I support my territorial parish. Then give me a territorial parish that supports me. Otherwise, I'm voting with my feet and my envelopes and going elsewhere. And I go to an ordinary liturgy, which, in my mind, embodies the exact reform that the Novus Ordo needs. Mass ad orientem, in the vernacular, prayers said out loud, communion received at an altar rail, on your knees, on the tongue, via intinction. Chant as the norm. Where hymns are sung, they are gorgeous traditional hymns. Lots and lots of incense and beautiful vestments.
Because we have that. We have that in our tradition. There's no reason why it need be kept from us.
Yeah, and the English of the ordinary Mass is elevated English.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
It's sacred language English.
Yeah.
I say, okay, we don't want to just make the Anglican patrimony the central ordinary form of the church. But I think if people got together, ordinariate people, TLM people, serious reform of the Reformed Novus Ordo people, we could do some serious good for the future of the church. Not under the current pontificate, which doesn't seem to be the slightest interested in this.
No.
But I still think the rad trads need to stop this scorched earth nonsense All right.
Okay.
Vatican II is heretical. The Pope is a Freemason. The Novus Ordo is invalid. Anyway, you get the point.
Well, yeah. So okay. So let's. I want to wrap this up because number one, this is everything I hoped it would be. I really enjoyed this, Larry.
Me too.
So you are about to publish part 2, I presume.
That will be probably by, tomorrow or Friday. Part 2 will come out. I've got some.
Well, I hope to get this up. I hope to get this up and out on the various YouTube channels, and I'll tweet it out and I'll let you know, and maybe you could sort of plug it on your blog.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it just depends on how quick I can get it processed on my computer. I'm a one-man show here, but I would love to sort of do a follow-up after part 2 and see where this goes.
Let's do. And one of the things that's taking so long for part 2 is I'm currently in the process of upgrading the blog. So I'm paying somebody to do stuff I can't do.
Trick it out a little bit. That's good.
That's right. It's getting tricked out a little.
All right. Well, Larry, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this, audience. I hope you enjoyed this, Larry.
Loved it.
And we'll be back for another episode together. So until then, goodbye and God bless. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
Godspeed.